Okay, I just want to say hello and welcome today for joining us for the 5th webinar in the series of Next Steps. This is a follow-on from First Steps, Caring for Community Archives, where we toured Scotland in 2019, delivering a one-day training event. So each webinar is an information-packed 30 minutes, which takes place every Monday morning. Today we hear from Kimberly Smith, archivist at Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire Archives. Kim will be talking about digitisation of archival material with particular reference to practical advice around choosing the right equipment and what to do with your digital files. This is being recorded and will be made available to everyone on the SCA website, and also I will announce it through Twitter, which is @CArchivesScot. A little bit of advice around housekeeping. So we're on a Zoom webinar. You are encouraged and very much welcome to ask questions during the presentation using the Q&A button. And that is at the bottom of my screen. It might be at the top of your screen, but you will see it's like a little shout out with Q&A, and then you can ask questions. And I will be looking at that during the presentation, and we can gather them all together, and Kim will be able to answer your questions live. This is a recorded webinar, so you're going to hear Kim's voice, but Kim will be with us live later on for the Q&A session. So without any more delay, I am going to press the play button and we can start. Enjoy.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the SCA Next Steps talk on digitisation. My name is Kimberly Smith and I'm an archivist at Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire Archives, which is a joint service where we collect, preserve and provide access to historical records relating to Aberdeenshire and the City of Aberdeen. We also ensure significant modern records are preserved for future generations. So I've been an archivist for the service for almost a year now, basically all of which has been working from home. As you can imagine, this means our access to physical records has been severely limited, and we've been working with a lot of digital content and trying to engage our users and researchers using previously digitised material. So this is just a list of the topics we're going to cover today. And this session follows on from the SCA's First Step sessions last year. Today's session will look at some of the practical elements involved in the digitisation process. We'll look at file naming, file formats, and how we ensure our digital files are kept safe and accessible for future use. I'm also going to demonstrate the processes we used to digitise a collection of glass plate negatives deposited by Aberdeen Harbour Board, and discuss how we make decisions on the type of equipment we use for digitisation. So my previous roles were based in London repositories. The variety of resource available in my various roles means I've approached digitisation from all manner of ways. So hopefully some of the practical skills and knowledge I've picked up will give you an idea how to start or progress your own digitisation projects. Firstly, I think it's important to note that the purpose behind your digitisation project is going to play a large part in steering and guiding your decision making and processes in the future. This slide shows some of the reasons why you may have decided to digitise your records. The bottom image here is of the oldest record we hold in Aberdeenshire Council's collections. So we decided to digitise this to assist long-term preservation and alleviate conservation concerns. You can see from the top image that in some cases conservation and preservation might be that deciding factor, especially based on the condition of some of the material that comes our way. But there are many other reasons why you may be digitising material, including to improve access, ensure transparency and accountability, or develop new revenue streams. So once you're clear on why you are digitising the material, I would recommend looking in more detail at what it is that you're actually going to be digitising. Assessing the different formats in the collection will allow you to see whether you might already have the right processes in place, or whether you're going to need to make some additional digitisation plans. If it is a single format collection, for example photographs, This makes life a lot easier. If the collection is across multiple formats and you intend to digitise the entire collection, then listing these formats is a good way to start to get to grips with the different types of digitisation you are going to need to do. So this is an example of a record from our poor relief material and shows that in material that is both a written record and an image. These were scanned separately using different digitisation methods. This is a simple spreadsheet that we used to assess the Aberdeen Harbour board glass plate negatives. These were deposited with us and digitised a couple of years ago. So it was just created in Word, but it allowed us to survey the collection by each box. And this is a more detailed spreadsheet that we used. This provided a more in-depth breakdown of the material, including the volume of each sized item, current packaging, and a running progress update on the material scanned. Listing the total extent of material in each format will also be useful at this stage, so that you can get an idea of what the timescales of your digitising work may look like. So if your collection is already catalogued, getting to grips with the formats of your collection is probably going to be easier. Having recorded the volume of material across multiple formats, this could seem too big a project and overly complicated. A lot of formats of archive material can be challenging and time-consuming to scan. So, for example, oversized folded plans or large-scale maps may not be appropriate for your equipment and require external or outsourced assistance. At this stage, there is nothing wrong with reassessing your digitisation project in order to simplify it, especially if scanning multiple formats of material is going to be too much work. So this was the case with the Aberdeen Harbour board material, where scanning discrete series and formats was a much more realistic approach than digitising the entire collection would ever be. Whilst you're preparing to digitise material, it is also important to think about the formats your digital items will take once they've been scanned or photographed. A file format is a standard way that information is encoded for storage in a computer file. Deciding on the file format prior to digitisation will save you a lot of time and energy. It's helpful to look at your other digital content and see what works best for your institution. Two of the examples shown on this slide are JPEG and TIFF. These are digital image file formats and are used regularly when digitising material. TIFFs tend to be larger files and take longer to scan, but have a higher resolution, and so the long-term benefits can be better. JPEGs are quicker to scan and easier to send and edit. It's also helpful to make a decision on your file naming structure prior to digitisation as well. As with physical box and item referencing and labelling, if you can say file names accurately and consistently from the beginning, it saves a lot of editing and confusion later on. So have a think about what you want your file names to show. Will it include the catalogue reference of your archive material and a description of the image? And would it be helpful to have a date in the name as well? So this slide shows some of the examples of file naming in our collections. On the left, we have an example of some file names for images digitised from the Harbour board material. You can see these use fairly simple file names that begin with the collection reference AHB. They give a brief description of the image and include the date. At the bottom, we have a set of references from a collection of school registers. These include a fuller reference, description, and page number information. Finally, at the top right of the slides are examples of digitised records from our poor relief material. So I hope you can see the issues of this format of file name. It includes our ARCON number at the beginning, which is definitely not necessary, followed by an abbreviation of the volume name, reference, and page number. The length of the reference is unwieldy, and all those zeros are definitely not necessary. So where are you going to save your digitised images? Who will have access to the content, and who will be able to use it in the future? This is definitely something you should organise before your project gets properly moving. It is unlikely you would accept a physical collection without checking your shelving space is sufficient. So why would you do differently with your digital files? If you can work out where your files will live early on, it will mitigate later problems with storage space and issues with hundreds of digital files floating around your system, saved onto desktops or lost in the cloud. Saving consistently on a shared space also means everyone can find and access the material. Here are some key questions to discuss and preferably answer before continuing your digitisation journey. Do you have a standardised file naming structure you can use? Where are you saving these files? And do you have enough storage space? So once you've decided what records you'd like to digitise and how they're going to look in the future, it's time to think about what equipment you're going to use to digitise these records most efficiently. For me, this is usually dependent on the format of the physical record. This is where any survey you've done of the materials formats will come in handy. So these images are of the Harbour board glass plate negatives. As you can probably tell, the glass plate negatives were repackaged during the digitisation process, something that you may wish to consider doing if it is practical, as it saves additional handling of material at a later date. So a set of 85 boxes of glass plates and lantern slides were initially reviewed by the archives team, and of these 77 boxes were retained. 1,700 glass plates were then cleaned, repackaged, scanned and listed. These items were scanned using our Flatbed Scanner. Ours is a full scap sized scanner, so slightly larger than A4. And these are just the general specifications that came with the scanner. So the two main settings to highlight for our glass plate negatives are the file format and the resolution. We scanned as TIFF files, which, as previously mentioned, can take longer to scan and take up more storage space, but offer a better quality of image in the long run. We scanned at 600 dpi, dots per inch, to ensure a high resolution for the master copy of our digital files. Image resolution is the detail an image holds, so for a clearer image, a higher resolution is better. Encouraging everyone to use the same resolution for scanning is helpful for ensuring consistency. So the scanner offers other setting options, as can be seen on the screen. These setting options usually appear when prompted by the scanner software. There are a lot of setting options for different formats, so it's important to pick the appropriate option for the material you are scanning. We found that settings were automatically scanned by the software following the initial setup, but I would definitely recommend documenting what you've chosen in case it doesn't save and needs to be inputted again. So the additional settings we used from these options were as follows. So in the first image on this slide, you can see where it says home mode at the top right-hand corner. We changed this to professional mode, which gave us the additional options on the right-hand side. So we chose film with film area guide as the document type and black and white negative film under film type. So under the destination, we made sure the resolution was set as 600 dpi. I probably wouldn't go any lower than this to create a digital master copy. And we scanned in a TIFF format only. In some cases, you can scan, you can instruct the scanner to scan as a TIFF and create a JPEG copy as well. And that's probably a pretty good way to make sure your files are consistent and accessible in different formats. So our scanner was set up so you could highlight a specific area of the scanner bed to scan. This meant we were not unnecessarily scanning the entire scanner bed. It made the scan time quicker and also provided a better and more detailed image. So just a few conservation points to note with the glass plate negatives and digitisation. It was recommended to us that Melanex or acetate should be put on the scanner bed, and this would help mitigate against abrasions when adjusting the glass plate negative. So we placed a square of this on the scanner. This can also be a useful tool to reduce handling, as it can be easier to pick up the Melanex at the corners than the delicate glass plate negatives. We also created a frame of plastizote on the scanner to ensure the lid didn't come into contact directly with material. And we also ensured all those working on the material were wearing gloves during all the processes. So here is the final result of just 12 of the scans we made from the glass plate negatives. This is them shown in tile format on our SharePoint system. The file referencing is the box number and then a running sequence. So in hindsight, it might have been useful to have an additional AHB, so collection reference, at the front of these file names, although the content is quite distinctive. Some of the Harbour board glass plate negatives were too large to be scanned using our scanner, so these are yet to be digitised. Flatbed scanners do come in different sizes, and on the screen there is an A3 flatbed scanner. It's great if you can afford a bigger size, as it does give a greater opportunity to scan larger items and is therefore more flexible in the long run. The flatbed scanners are rarely, if ever, going to be appropriate for volumes. They don't have the right support for the volume spine, and the weight and pressure of the hood is likely to cause damage and strain to the spine and text block. There are alternatives, however. For example, on the screen are the book scanners. The two images here show a newer model versus a relatively old model. In a previous role, we had an older book scanner that looked more like the image on the right. It was at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of the resolution it could produce, but it definitely made scanning volumes much easier. There was no strain on the binding or damage to the pages, and it was easy to use. It still gave the option to digitise as a TIFF or a JPEG, and with settings that could be adjusted to focus on either or both pages. Because this was quite a robust piece of equipment, we were happy for our researchers to utilise it as well. All they needed to bring was a USB stick, and then we could provide basic training and charge a small fee for the use. So we don't have a book scanner at Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire Archives service. So we often have to outsource digitisation for some items, or we can use a camera to digitise volumes. In the case of our arrival registers for the Harbour board, a volume of which is shown on the screen, pages were photographed for use in a digital transcription project. This was focused on records dated 1914 to 1920 and is a good example that shows there is still value in digitising discrete parts of collections. So each individual page, all 649 of them, was photographed by our project archivist, Molly. So both the cameras we have are relatively old, which means there can be issues with the resolution of images and their quality. We are careful to set up the cameras with a tripod and volumes with a bookrest when digitising. This ensures the volume spine is always supported. Because of the incline of the volume, it can be difficult to adjust snake weights to keep the pages flat, but overall you can get a fairly good and steady shot using a tripod and this method. Something to bear in mind when digitising material using a camera is that it can involve working from height. So I'd always recommend to use a secure stepladder or alternative, and preferably digitise when another member of staff is on site. So now that you've selected material, decided on file formats and file naming, ensured you have adequate storage space, and purchased your equipment, are you finally ready to start? It may be easy to throw yourself into the digitisation process at this point, especially with a team of keen staff members and volunteers. However, at this stage, familiarisation and training are key. Take some time to practice using the equipment and understand the software. Scan a batch of material as a test run to iron out any issues and ensure your processes run smoothly. And make sure you've got the knowledge to disseminate information to your colleagues and volunteers so that the project can be completed cohesively and consistently. Finding any issues at this stage will give you the opportunity to adjust any inefficient or unhelpful processes before scanning a large volume of records. Additionally, you also need to be aware of GDPR and data protection, both when digitising material and storing files. Firstly, it is important to think about the content of the material you are digitising. If records contain personal or sensitive information that falls within GDPR regulations, then additional measures must be taken to ensure the security of the data for future use and access. It is helpful to have these types of records checked and flagged on any catalogue system before digitising large volumes of material. This ensures security measures are in place from the beginning rather than as an afterthought. Files that contain sensitive data should be digitised by employees or trusted volunteers. The method for digitising items containing personal or sensitive data will need some tweaking too. Not all digitising equipment is secure, so we don't have a password protection on our camera, for instance. Using personal mobile and tablet devices may feel quicker at the time. especially when digitising individual files for short research requests. But you've also got to bear in mind that they are not the most secure method for storing or transferring data either. Images can easily be lost, forgotten, or accidentally deleted. It is therefore always best to use one official device that is stored securely rather than a mobile device that is carried between sites and at an increased risk of being hacked if lost or stolen. Sensitive data should be transferred from the device into a secure system as soon as possible following digitisation, and best practice would usually dictate the device is then cleared following this process. This is good practice for digitisation generally. If you back up images from a device to a computer at the time, then this minimises the risk of losing material and the time needed to rescan items. So digitised records containing personal or sensitive data will need to be stored in a secure and limited access system. And in terms of the security of files in the future, you will need to think about ongoing digital preservation and whether to keep multiple copies across different storage systems in case one copy should fail. So one possible approach is keeping one copy locally on a hard disk and a second copy in cloud storage. So these are just some final things to consider. So documentation is key. Make sure to clearly record your decisions. Work within your resource and limits. Obtaining digitisation equipment can be an expensive outlay, so it is important to make sure your digitisation warrants the cost. This is where it's helpful to project the usage of your material in a digitised format. So are you going to get enough use from the digitised material to make it worth the cost of equipment? In some cases, it is worth looking at digitisation partnerships. Perhaps you can source local funding for the equipment to get started, or is there a partnership available with an interested party who will share the costs and equipment? You need to work within your resource and limits. There is no point attempting a huge digitisation project within a limited time frame if you do not have the manpower or time to achieve it. So it's vital to prioritise what items you digitise and why. It's proactive and regular process. So although digitising a collection can be a completable task in itself, that does not mean your work with the digital records you've created is complete. Digital records often require more and consistent and regular review to ensure they are protected against file corruption or loss of data. Also, it's a repetitive process. So as with a lot of work within the archive sector, getting it right can be time consuming and in some cases tedious. If your digitisation project utilises volunteers, then you may want to alternate or rotate the digitisation processes to ensure that the repetitive nature of the work does not lead to boredom or disinterest. And I've also just popped at the bottom there handling training. So I think it's vital that if you are going to be digitising daily, that all volunteers and anyone working with the material has handling training, just to ensure that the material is conserved and preserved appropriately. And that's just a few of the images from our Harbour board collection there. And that's everything, I think. So if anyone's got any questions, then that would be great. And thank you for listening.
Lots and lots of questions. It's absolutely wonderful to see. And I am going to ask Kim some of your questions. If we don't get round to everything, I will have a chat with Kim later, but also we will be giving out an email address so you can ask any of your questions directly to Kim, maybe the team up in Aberdeen as well. But let's get cracking. And the first question, which happened very, very early on, is from Alison Wright. We have scanned a whole host of records to PDF. Is there a really good program that we can use to convert these to searchable files? Optical recognition, she said, question marks and brackets. Any advice, Kim?
Morning. Yeah, that's a really tricky one that's come up. I think someone else has asked that later on as well.
Yeah.
So the PDFs are really difficult documents to adjust once they've been created. I think what we've done in the past is we've scanned or photographed and used JPEGs and then copied sort of images into a Word file and then had that as the kind of entire item. I think something else that we might have used is OneNote, which is another Microsoft sort of software, which allows you to have multiple items within the same document.
Yeah.
But as to converting PDFs back out of a PDF, I think I sent a link to that question for it. It's an Adobe software, but it's probably something that you need a license for, so it's going to cost you some money, unfortunately.
Great.
But yeah, the PDFs are quite an unwieldy format.
Yes, you're right. There has been a couple of questions because Orla asked the same thing about how do you scan multiple documents into one file without it being a PDF? Yeah,
it's really tricky because you're obviously looking to kind of create this surrogate that emulates the hard physical volume, and in order to do that and photograph each page and then create it into one item, doing it as a PDF does make sense because you can have them all sort of stored as one. But then obviously you're stuck with a PDF, which isn't great.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kim. There's another couple of questions around photographic material, especially transparencies and negatives. So it says, do you have, this is Ravana has asked, do you have any suggestions for methods of digitizing transparencies and negatives within a photograph collection? And also Jill Fewings has asked, would you mind sharing negs and glass plate resources, please? So both questions related to glass plate negatives.
Absolutely. They're quite another tricky format to digitize. I think the fact that they're so delicate can cause quite a lot of problems, and that's definitely something where your handling needs to be quite careful. So training around handling is obviously important there. But yeah, I can definitely share some of the links that we looked at. So we did a bit of research, and we also had conversations with conservators about how we were going to digitize those. So you can use the scanner. You can also set up with a camera. So that's another alternative. But it's definitely something I can share the links for, so that you can look at that in a bit more detail.
I was just going to ask him, you very kindly sent through some links to me, which I included in the Zoom invite. Would those links perhaps have information about glass plate negatives and transparency?
The TNA one should have, that's quite a long document, but it should have some glass plate negatives in there. I can't remember what the other one I sent was. It might have been the Digital Preservation Coalition.
Yeah,
yeah, they tend to be really useful. It's another really useful resource to look at, and they've got a really handy just a handbook that runs through everything from the base level. So that's definitely one to look at.
I was going to say, I'm very happy to send those links out again to everyone, because I will be sending a feedback form to everyone just to find out, what you would like more of in training. So I will also send out the links at the same time. I've a really good question here, actually. It's from Ruth Brown, and I do want to include it. I thought scanning was not good for the documents and photographs. Is this true?
I mean, any handling of delicate items is always going to be tricky. If you want to digitize, then scanning isn't the worst thing you can do. If you're looking to do the best option, then photographing, because you're not putting any weight on the item. Photographing without a flash especially means that you're not going to cause any damage to the photographs. I did respond to that one, and I just pointed out that there is a difference between digitizing with scanners. Then the light that's in a scanner is different from the light that's in a photocopier. So we would never advise anyone to photocopy documents or photographs, because there is a difference in the light that's used. And so photocopiers can really damage items, whereas the scanners aren't quite so harsh.
Great. Here is another couple of questions, actually, around digitisation services, and I'm not sure actually that you will be able to answer this, but do you know if they're very expensive? And also another question from Sheena is, do you have any recommendations for outsourcing scanners, which would be useful for a very small place, as they only have a few items that they want digitized? It's not whole collections. Is that, especially, actually, I should mention larger items such as maps and plans, which really can be quite big. I'm thinking A2,
yeah,
A1.
we do. we do outsource. I can't think off the top of my head who we outsource to, but yeah, the maps and larger items need to go elsewhere. We only have the full scanner, so it's not big enough, and there's only so much height you can get with a camera to photograph an entire document. So what I would suggest is just contacting local services, local museums, local archives, and seeing what they use and whether there might be a partnership that you could create with them. I think that's quite useful just to get an idea of, do some research of what else is being used in your local area, because they might be willing to sort of have a conversation with you about whether it's worth them digitising a few of your items, especially if you're a small institution yourself. When I was working down in London, we did do some photography and some scanning for smaller institutions, just because they don't have the resource there. Because yeah, it is expensive, and outsourcing it is very expensive.
And something maybe for in-house on smaller items, but glossy photographs, any top tips that you might have, Kim, for scanning glossy photos?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's all about your angles, isn't it, with the camera, trying to get the light right. I mean, it's always trial and error for me on those ones. It just depends on what sort of setup you've got. But yeah, having as little light in the room so that you're not catching the glare. But yeah, I'm not sure on that one, I'm afraid.
Okay, I'm just going to have a couple more questions here. I'm sort of running through them, looking at my other screen. From Orla, I used to scan multiple page documents as TIFFs and JPEGs, but then when adding to digital archive, they were separate pages, which was harder for people to read. I think this is going back to about the question about PDFs, actually. I started to save as PDFs and then added these, but there are issues with accessibility of PDFs. So looking for a workable alternative for multi-page items. Have we covered that in the last one?
I think I mentioned about using OneNote as an option. It is difficult if you don't have Microsoft, or if you're a smaller institution and don't have the licenses for that. But yeah, it's definitely one to look into. I'm not sure of any other options really.
This is one from Erica from Dorking Museum. Welcome, down in England. It's the storage of the data once it's digitized. Can you recommend a couple of models we could research, please?
So we use, at the moment, we're using SharePoint, which has a large storage. We've got a lot of storage on that, but it's not always user-friendly. We're also just looking at the moment into Preservica, which is a really good resource for storing your digital files. It's one that a lot of archives use if they can afford the sort of outlay on it, because it can be quite expensive. But yeah, if you're storing a lot of data, it's really useful.
Yeah, I think that might answer Frank's question as well about commercial software packages. So that's great.
Yeah, Preservica is definitely one to look at.
Something I think is interesting, and it's something I'd like to even think about doing sort of specifically a training event on, is like how do you train volunteers in this? What's your approach in Aberdeen?
So you can either go two ways and train a group of volunteers at the same time, or one-on-one volunteer training, which I prefer it. I think if you can focus with one person and just run through the stages with them, then that's really helpful, and letting them try it as you go, so that you're kind of solidifying that information. But it does take time to get used to the functions, the different software and the equipment. So I think having time one-on-one and definitely letting them try things out while you're there, rather than running through a whole list of a whole stream of sort of information and then just expecting anyone to get on with that, is quite difficult. So yeah, running through the software definitely, and just using the equipment and not being afraid of the equipment or the software or of doing anything wrong. And yeah, tied in with that is the handling training of the documents and the photographs themselves.
Okay, I just want to have a couple of questions because I realize we're kind of running over time here. But that's, That's great. There's so many questions here. It's fantastic. Just wanted to say thank you, Sheena. She's reminded us there's a Midlothian forum, which includes the Mining Museum. So again, getting help from other community archives is a great way forward, and even joining forces and collaborating. I thank Catherine Gillis as well. She's given some advice in the Q&A about PDFs. I'm not going to sort of detail that, but I think that's very helpful for people. Great question, just a practical question from Grimsey, so the Hebrides. Any advice for lighting items that are being digitized, i.e. the balance between getting a good quality digital file and the conservation of the item? So that's looking at light levels as well, isn't it? Photographs are sensitive to light.
Yeah, sensitive to the light. Again, that comes back to researching your scanner, I think, and making sure that you're getting a scanner that's sort of been approved. So the DPC is another good resource for looking at the different types of equipment you can use. It is a fine balance. You've got to remember that once you've digitized it and you've got that digital surrogate, then you've got another layer of protection for the original, because you're not going to be handling the original as often.
Great. I'm going to have to sort of close at this point, but there's been very nice sharing of advice on the Q&A, which is wonderful. I do want to share something from Ruth Brown. She's based up in Dunkeld, and they have got a very new system. They got some external funding. It's called the Vanguard system, and for digitizing their collections, and would be very happy to share it. But you need to contact Ruth Brown at Dunkeld Cathedral Archives, because she's very happy for you to come up and use the equipment, but she's not going to spend huge amounts of time doing it for you. You're going to have to do it yourself. So that's very kind. And another thing from Margaret Stewart, which is wonderful, is perhaps contact the National Library of Scotland for a service for digitising large maps and plans. So that's really helpful. I think we need
it's
to
such
go.
a large topic. There's so many different elements to it that it's hard to get the detail on in such a short space of time.
Yes, and it has been recorded. Someone has mentioned the closed captions can be a bit odd in places. I'm not sure I can edit that. My technical skills are very limited. We may have to put up with the closed captions that have been put up, but you will be able to have the recording later on today. I just want to thank him very, very much for that. It's been wonderful. It's a great resource in itself, having this webinar, but I'll also send out the links. So thank you, everyone. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I will hopefully see some of you next Monday morning. Thanks very much. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.